this morning we saw lots of videos coming out of thousands of individuals, returning to North Gaza. Basically, they'd had to flee south, and lots of people. It was both reassuring and positive seeing people return to their homeland. It was also hard to watch. It drew back a lot of imagery that reminded me of what it would have been like to watch the Trail of Tears or something, right? You could just tell that something horrible had happened there. Trump is actively cheerleading for these people to be permanently removed to places like Jordan or Egypt, permanently displaced. But on the other hand, you did see these people that were walking freely. They weren't wearing bulletproof vests. They weren't taking cover. The carnage had paused. How should our audience understand the distinctions between Joe Biden's abysmal failure, foreign policy wise, as president, and what a lot of people are quick to point to as successes, as Donald Trump has mitigated the disasters, at least for now, in Gaza?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we're all relieved to see people who are just not being constantly bombed and starved right at this moment. And so, having that sense of relief and celebrating for people who have just suffered an unimaginable amount is certainly appropriate. However, I mean, it's already clear, it's already going. Like Trump is talking about, Kushner's out talking about waterfront development. Trump sees Gaza and he sees dollar signs too as a real estate developer. The IDF has expanded their military goals to include the West Bank. And then he just comes out with it and says, hey, what we need to do here is clean that whole thing out. I think something like that was the exact term, and push all Palestinians into neighboring countries. He, specifically naming Egypt and Jordan. So it's quite plain what the plan here is. It's a sort of a final solution that is the ultimate plan. This is very consistent with who Trump's allies were on the campaign trail. The sort of rhetoric that he used on the campaign trail is very consistent with his first term in office as well. So even as it's great to see this temporary ceasefire, it's also very important to keep in mind what the ultimate plans are going to be. There was something else that I actually didn't catch right away, but Trump, when he made those comments pushing for ethnic cleansing, said there are 1.5 million people in that area. Well, previously there were 2 million. So do you know something that we don't know? Because he did reveal some numbers that he presumably got from intelligence estimates with regard to the number of people killed in Ukraine. So is this a window into how many Gaza Palestinians were actually murdered during this onslaught?
Yeah, just to follow up, obviously Donald Trump is, taking the reins when we're involved in multiple conflicts around the world. Seems like pretty much always the United States is involved in multiple conflicts around the world. What do you expect the tone he's going to take is in terms to the war in Ukraine? Obviously, he famously, boasted that he was going to end it on day one. That didn't
Yeah,
happen. He had Marco
right.
Rubio on Fox News kind of backpedaling, saying, well, he's going to deal with it. What kind of a tone do you think he'll strike there, given the fact that, Russia is kind of depleted? You also have Iran, China, North Korea, all these different things that he had as legacy positions from 2016 that could potentially boil up over this next administration. What are things that you're keeping your eye out for there?
There seems to be some internal battle going on in terms of the position vis-a-vis Iran and whether he will follow a similarly hawkish approach as he did in his first term. There are different voices within there. And so we'll see. I mean, I'll believe it when I see it, because so much of the Republican base, Republican elected elites, Republican donor class, et cetera, is married to the idea of being constantly confrontational with Iran. We know, of course, Trump got out of the Iranian nuclear deal. We know that was very important to Israel, continues to be very important to Israel. So like I said, I'll believe it when I see it. With regard to Ukraine, it's incredible how Trump is just held to such a different standard. This was such a clear promise he made on the campaign trail. He said that war would be over before he was even in office. And guess what? It's not. And guess what? There's no sign that it's going to be over anytime soon. In fact, I think what his supporters expected is that he would immediately go in and put the screws to Zelensky and say, you're just going to accept, however things are going to be. You're going to come to the deal and effectively, completely capitulate to the Russians at this point. And let me be clear. I think this war needs to end. I think the U.S. under Biden made a grave, horrific, tragic, unforgivable error by blocking attempts at peace early on in the war. But instead of pressure being put on Zelensky at this point, Trump is actually following a very similar path as what the Biden administration did, which is to threaten additional sanctions on Russia, which have not been successful thus far, in order to try to, exert some leverage vis-a-vis Putin. So again, we'll see how this all plays out. I think there's more question marks than answers with regard to Ukraine as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
One
totally.
thing that, just one other thing on that, it was very noteworthy to me that on his inauguration day, he gave his big speech and he did a rally and he gave another speech and like lots of words were said. He didn't say anything about Ukraine. And it was a key part of his campaign. So that tells me he knows that he is not living up to the expectations that were set for his base. And it really was, such a key part of his pitch. And then he never gets called on the fact that, like, you promised this and you already have failed to deliver. Instead, the mainstream press is like, oh, promises made, promises kept. Look at all the amazing stuff this guy is doing.
Yeah, actually, when it comes to Ukraine, that's interesting. What do you think a successful sort of diplomatic end to that conflict would look like? Do you think that Zelensky is going to have to surrender significant portions of the Ukrainian territory of his sovereignty over to Putin in order to actually end this war? And do you think that's something that Trump could convince him to do?
I mean, Trump could definitely, but just it's not that different from the situation with Israel. Like Zelensky, the Ukrainians, they're very reliant on us, right? They don't have a prayer of continuing this fight without the weaponry and the funds that we've been providing. I think that's that's quite clear. So yes, at this point, is he going to have to accept some significant loss of territory? Yes, absolutely. And then the none of the answers here are easy whatsoever, because the time when the Ukrainians had the best positioning was early in the conflict, when they did kind of surprise the Russians and outperform what everybody's expectations were for how they could do vis-a-vis, a vastly larger, technologically superior, et cetera, military. Now you're in this kind of stalemate situation. Russia has a vastly larger population, way more resources that they can throw at this thing. And they've lost a tremendous number of lives, as have the Ukrainians. But the Russians do have a greater ability just to sort of persist indefinitely. And I don't think Putin cares about throwing his own people into the meat grinder indefinitely as well. So it's not an easy situation to resolve. I think you have to probably put pressure on both sides to try to get them to the negotiating table. And the other reason I'm skeptical of Trump bringing this thing to a close is, it typically, unfortunately, leaders don't get rewarded for bringing wars to a close. We saw what happened with Biden in Afghanistan. When you end a war, you no longer get to deal with the fairy tale or the propaganda that you've sold to the people about how this war is going.
Good point.
And so whatever deal is struck, I mean, there's going to be, the media is gonna hate it. They're gonna tear it apart.
Democrats will probably attack Trump if he does end the war anyway.
Absolutely. It's the one thing, I mean, you can rely on the media to be quite bipartisan in attacking any leader who ends a war. I mean, this was really the beginning of the end in terms of Biden's popularity with regards to Afghanistan, even though the American people were saying, we need to end this. Like, this is ridiculous. What have we been doing there? But of course, when that withdrawal occurred and instantly the Taliban's back in power, and it is an ugly scene all the way around of, this becomes this gigantic debacle for the Biden administration. And you can kind of see similar thing happening in Israel right now. And even in this temporary ceasefire moment, like for Bibi, it's a very fraught time because he told them, oh, we're going to totally eradicate Hamas. That was always a fantasy. That was never going to happen. And yet now, you see the images of Hamas fighters back in the street in, relative full force and taking back control.
I think people are speculating they may have more fighters than ever before now.
Well, that's not like randos speculating. Tony Blinken said it, Yeah. So, and listen, he's a liar, so who knows? But it wouldn't surprise anyone if they were able to recruit quite significantly out of this carnage. So in any case, the whole point is just Trump is no fool when it comes to understanding propaganda wins and losses and the way the media is likely to portray things. I think that's why he didn't ultimately get out of Afghanistan, because he knew that reckoning would come. And it will be a similar thing with Ukraine. And he may just decide that it's politically easier to keep funding it and keep kicking the can down the road and hope to pass it off to a successor as more and more people die.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that assessment, and I share your frustration over what happened under Biden with the Afghanistan withdrawal. Still such a frustrating situation, not only the way that the public reacted, not only the way that the media talked about it, but also the way that Biden himself and his administration refused to properly communicate their decision or defend it to the American people. I thought that was a huge failure
Absolutely.
PR, frankly. But you're right. I could see a similar thing happening. Like, even if Trump was able to negotiate an end to this conflict, I could see the media saying, well, he just, he gave Russia all this land. How dare he wrap up this war without Ukraine having all of their sovereignty intact? This is a spit in the face of, the sovereignty of our allies and stuff like that. It's a similar situation, like you said, with Israel. And I actually think one of the reasons why Biden was so feckless on the issue was because of its proximity to the upcoming election, right? He was probably terrified by the media saying, oh, Joe Biden abandoned Israel right after the biggest terrorist attack in their country's history. He let all these Israeli citizens get slaughtered and then didn't even, let them defend themselves, right? That's what he thought the narrative would be going into election day. Not that it justifies his response at all. But do you see what I'm saying?
I do. I actually held that view and I've kind of changed my mind. I actually think it's the opposite. I think all the little PR moves that they did, oh, we had a tough conversation with Bibi. Oh, we're withholding this one shipment of bombs. And oh, they're totally bending to our will. And look at how they didn't do a full invasion of Rafah, which now that we have this temporary ceasefire, you can see Rafah is completely destroyed. Like the idea that there was some restraint that was exercised there is utterly preposterous. I actually think that was the part that was for out of political expediency to try to appease people, who have a conscience and don't want to see babies slaughtered with American-made bombs. I think Biden was happy to go along with all of it. I think he is a committed Zionist. I think that he was comfortable. I don't think he sees Palestinians as human beings. That to me is 100% perfectly clear. And so, I don't think he was so feckless that he didn't realize he had no influence in the situation. He didn't want to exercise any influence in the situation. He thought that this was the correct course. That's the conclusion that I've come to after watching all of this unfold, and also watching the exit interviews with the American ambassador to Israel, with Tony Blinken, I think it was Tony Blinken who admitted, like, no, we didn't really exert any pressure on them. We never told them there wasn't anything that they could do. It's like, okay, well, then clearly you were good with this policy, and this was what you and the Biden administration wanted out of this situation.